Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Kristen.
And my name is Katie. And we want to spend a few minutes a day with you walking through the New Testament, one chapter at a time. This year, we will fix our gaze upon Christ so that we may know him, not only with our minds, but with our hearts.
Together, we will learn that who Jesus is changes everything.
Hey, welcome back to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Katie, and together we are walking through the New Testament in a year. Currently, we are studying 1 Corinthians, and today we will be in 1 Corinthians 7. As always, you can follow along with the Behold studies in the Daily Grace Co. shop or with the reading plan linked in the show notes. In today's chapter, Paul transitions from addressing concerns reported to him from Chloe's household about the Corinthians' behavior to addressing matters within a letter written to him by the Corinthians. As Paul answers this letter, he will cover a variety of topics: spiritual gifts, worship, head coverings, idolatry, and communion. But today, Paul will focus in on marriage. So far, we have seen that the Corinthians have allowed sexual immorality to exist within the church unchecked. And today, we see another extreme position, that even married couples should abstain from sex, evidently included in the Corinthians letter to Paul. Isn't it just like humans to try to trend towards one extreme or the other? In Paul's response, we should see him address both extremes. Paul's wisdom to the Corinthians is this: be faithful and pursue God first in whatever he's called you to. Satisfaction will ultimately be found in him, not in fleeting pleasures of sex or status. That being said, Paul upholds God's good boundaries in marriage, that it is a blessing and a privilege to be in the context of marriage. In fact, Proverbs 5:18 says, "Let the fountain be blessed and take pleasure in the wife of your youth." And Song of Songs is a whole book in the Bible that upholds the beauty and goodness of sex between a husband and a wife. Sex was created by God for procreation and pleasure for his people, but it is not a gift to be abused or taken advantage of. Remember, as we studied 1 Corinthians 6, our bodies are not our own. Our bodies are purchased with a price and have value as Christ's own body. As Paul heard reports about the Corinthian church, he saw that sexual immorality was common. We know that prostitution was happening and that they turned a blind eye to a man sleeping with a stepmother. And so Paul says that if you can't control your desire, it is good for you to be married. It is good for sex to be enjoyed within the bounds created by God for human flourishing. And Paul shares that both the husband and wife have the responsibility to fulfill the desires of one another. There may be periods of time when abstinence is necessary to devote more time to prayer, but Paul encourages married couples to come back together again so that they are not tempted into lust or to commit adultery. I love that Paul does not say, do not have sex within marriage or have sex all the time with anyone. Paul recognizes the good boundaries God creates and helps the Corinthians to glorify God within the status God has called them to. Paul has more advice regarding marriage in verses 10 through 16. Paul protects the covenant of marriage set forth by God. Before we dive into these verses, I want us to remember that Jesus confirms the institution of marriage in Mark 10, 6 through 9, when he says, "But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined, let no man separate." Jesus looks all the way back to creation narrative in Genesis 2, reminding his audience that two become one in marriage. So too, Paul is a servant, reiterating the advice of his master. He says that a wife is not to leave her husband, even if he is an unbeliever, and vice versa. Who knows if God will use the believing husband or wife to bring the unbeliever to faith? And for the kids' sake, having one believing parent in the household is far better than none. Perhaps God will use the believing parent to bring kids to faith. Paul upholds, as Jesus did, the sanctity of marriage. But even as great and as sanctifying as marriage can be, Paul writes that for those who are singled or widowed, it might be preferable to remain single so that they can devote themselves fully to the gospel mission without distraction. Those with husbands and wives are distracted in caring for their marriage and families, while those without can concern themselves wholly to pleasing the Lord. Their desire for intimacy, for love, and affection can be found fully in Jesus. He is enough to meet that need. Singleness provides an opportunity to devote oneself to the Lord and better understand that He is enough to sustain and satisfy us. I love that in this chapter, Paul shares biblical wisdom. He sees a problem within the church and he uses God's wisdom to solve it. Wisdom that we have seen the Corinthians struggle to understand themselves. Though Paul says his preference is singleness, it is good for others to get married if they desire. Again, the Corinthians are missing the point. It's not about rules and regulations. It's not about who's right and who's wrong. It's about loving the Lord with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, no matter where He's called us. Singleness, marriage, or in the context of the Corinthian church, circumcised or uncircumcised, slave or free. Life is too short to wish our time away chasing after greener grasses. Instead, Paul calls the Corinthians to enjoy the Lord and devote ourselves to wherever God has called them right now. In a world that dangles a new level of happiness in the form of vacation, new careers, better houses, and better relationships, Paul's wisdom hits home. He calls us to be faithful and satisfied in the season we're in. Hebrews 12:2 calls us to look to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who found the fullness of joy in His Father. No matter the season of life or the status we find ourselves in, Jesus remains the same. Jesus was perfectly faithful in all God called Him to, even death. May we follow in His footsteps and be faithful to steward the stories God has given each of us, keeping our eyes on where our hope is found, where the fullness of satisfaction will be ours, in eternity with our Savior, our perfect husband, who will be faithful to come back for His bride, the church. We behold Jesus today as true satisfaction, the true joy, and the true pleasure of His church. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. Don't forget to check out the show notes for helpful links and resources related to today's episode. And make sure you are following at Daily Grace Podcast on Instagram for more A Year in the Bible content, and at the Daily Grace Co. for all things Bible study resources. We can't wait to study again with you tomorrow. Bye, friends.